Hey everyone, this is Louis7 and I have a tier list in the Lord of the Rings Online. This one does come a couple years after my previous one and I have a lot of changes that will be going on in this. First of all, I'm actually splitting my tier list video into two videos. Actually, the first part here is going to be more objective based on the viability of the classes, while the second will be what my old one actually was, which is just more of a favorites tier list. So that will be coming in a later video. I also do want to point out that I wanted to do this video before the Gundabad expansion in the Brawler class comes out later this year. So this will be kind of my baseline 2021 class tier list for both this video actually and my favorites list that will be coming up next. But I will personally be very interested to see how all of this changes when those things do actually come out. My current plan is to actually make these tier list videos a little bit more frequently than 2 years apart, and for the next set will actually be with post-Brawler and post-Gundabad. But that aside, I do want to give some brief background about each tier. So actually the first tier I want to talk about is the viable tier. That's kind of a baseline tier for a class having a single viable spec. Now in LOTRO, each class does have 3 specs, but I'm going to rate viability mainly on at least 1 spec being viable, and then excels as if it is very particular good at its very specific role, or if it even has multiple specs, multiple roles that are viable within that class. And finally, best just means it is basically the best at something, or really that it goes even beyond excelling and maybe has multiple things viable at once compared to all the other classes. Now moving down, actually somewhat viable would mainly mean a class that there are other classes, other specs that are preferred for whichever role it is with that class that they do, and it's just not quite as good as others. Now situational is one that is good in certain cases but otherwise pretty much bad, and finally bad just means it is not good. It does not really provide anything, not even something situational to the current endgame in LOTRO. And that actually reminds me of a good point. This is mainly based on endgame viability and raiding group content, and well, that all means instances, both the easier stuff and the more difficult stuff, because viability basically applies to all that, even though less viable classes will still be good, at least for lower tier stuff in LOTRO. But again, this will be generally based on the entirety of endgame. So I know certain classes excel at like 12-man raids compared to 6-man instances and 3-man instances. All those can be a little bit different. But again, this is just overall viability and how they can apply to those types of content. At least that as the goal. So also I do want to point out I will be splitting this video actually into multiple sections. So first we will go with like the overall ranking I have for each class and how they fit just overall within the game. And then we'll look at the individual roles for the next few sections. First we'll take a look at the DPS specs specifically for each class, also called damage dealer or whatever you want to call that. Next up we will look at the tanks and then the healers and finally the support. And importantly, I define each of these roles. As we go through it with all the classes, it will be their primary role is where I'm going to be splitting that up into, as we will see. But let's go ahead and get started with the overall section. Now, I will be going through the classes in alphabetical order. There's really nothing special about that. It's just alphabetical order, and we start with the Beorning. Now the Beorning, they are not the most viable DPS specs. That would rate very lowly, but we have to consider things other than DPS, of course, and they would be considered probably a somewhat viable or viable tank, but they're actually really good at healing, and their healing offers a lot of support that they really excel at that role, and they do have the option to actually tank, so they will be, for our first class, they will excel in the current meta with their balance and viability. Next up we have the Burglar, and they are actually in a pretty good spot both with their support, their yellow line of course being heavily wanted, at least one yellow line Burglar in each raid, and then their damage is also pretty good at the moment, so I would also move them to excels with the Burglar. So we have 2 strong classes to start off, and the Captain, as many people probably know right now, they are pretty good. They are definitely not bad, they're viable, and they even excel both in the red line and especially the yellow line tanking, so much so that I think they are the best class at the moment for viability. They're tanking, they're really the best tanks in the game, largely because of the support they provide. They have strong cooldowns and just overall good defenses for the type of content that is going on at endgame right now. And even their blue line is probably somewhat viable to viable. That can be used for 6-man instances and even 3-man instances, especially content where you don't need as much direct healing and a lot of AoE spread out healing. Their blue line is actually pretty decent with that. So in summary, they primarily get that rating for being the best tank, being viable for their red line support, and for having somewhat viability in the blue line. So again, all three specs there is pretty amazing with that class. Next up we have Champion, and this one is going to be, they're very good at AoE damage and single target damage. They do have that flexibility, but there's nothing that really makes them stand out in those two particular cases. While they're good, they are viable, they just don't quite excel at that. And I do admit that the flexibility in AoE versus single target is nice, but you have to decide on one of those specs for a fight, of course. And I should also point out that melee DPS right now is just unfortunately not as good of a situation as range DPS. Generally, if you can do the exact same amount of DPS, and if you can choose between range versus melee, typically range would be preferred because it's usually easier to avoid stuff, and being out of melee range generally means you are safer. Next up we have the Guardian, and unfortunately this class it's pretty bad, but their tanking can be situationally useful, but their DPS is no good, their L line is not that viable, and their tanking is just not as good as a captain, but it is situational that you can still take a blue line Guardian as like an off tank, or if you don't have a captain available for tanking, of course you can take a Guardian, but I reserve them for more situational use as far as viability with how I'm ranking things. And next up we have the Hunter, and they are a pretty viable range DPS right now. I would almost put them at Excels. In fact, because the Hunter's primary role and only role they can do is actually range DPS, I will put them at Excels. Compared to the Champion, they may have similar damage or even a little bit more, but again, being ranged, they have a lot of benefit with the range, and of course, while this definitely doesn't matter for actual group content viability, them having a taxi service is very nice as well. They just don't provide all too much utility typically, just a lot of straight range damage. Moving on, we finally get into some tactical classes, and we have the Lore Master. Now, the Lore Master DPS is no good, but they do have their yellow line support, which is often needed or at least very helpful in 12-man raid content, and I would put them viable in the yellow line for that. They're probably not the most useful class in lower group size content, but they could definitely be considered at least somewhat viable there, and due to their need, or at least the raid content needing a single yellow line Lore Master, I do believe they are viable just for their support there. Similarly, the Minstrel, they are a very viable healer. I wouldn't say they excel, unlike the Baroning. The Baroning yellow line again provides not only good healing, but they provide a lot of support with that. The Minstrel does provide some support, which they're not bad at, but also because their red line is just absolutely no good. As far as filling out an actual DPS role, it is not that good. But their healing again, and what they provide overall is just like standard viable. And I do want to point out, just with the viable category in general, in case it is not coming across clearly, this does not mean they are bad. If you compare them to the classes that excels, it does not mean they are bad. It just means they're like a notch down from what I'm considering like excels versus viable. Yellow Minstrel, of course, is a viable healer and not a bad choice if you do want to heal. So I did just want to make that very clear, so it sounds like I'm not just saying the Minstrel is not that good. But next up with the Runekeeper, the problem here is it is not that good. It's not in a good spot. Their healing compared to both the Minstrel and Baroning, while the healing output can be pretty good, they don't provide much support at all with the healing. Their DPS is not in a good spot. The primary DPS line, the red line, is actually weaker than the yellow line, the more utility-based and mobile DPS spec, and then even the yellow line has been nerfed from more of its glory days back a few months ago, so it is just not that good. And the only class, I guess as a spoiler, that will end up being in the bad category as an overall class. Now moving on, we have the Warden, and this is also one I would put, it's pretty viable and it could even excel. So the Warden's very odd because it has a lot of potential to be very good at DPS, to be the top DPS in the game, but there are some mechanics, namely RNG and lag. Those two things can set the Warden down to just viable or even somewhat viable if you run into a lot of issues. They could even be bad if you play the Warden poorly on top of that stuff. But overall, based on their potential, I will put them at excels. But if you really can get the mechanics down, they will definitely be a DPS class that excels over time. One problem they do run into is a lot of their damage is over time based, and sometimes stacking two Wardens in a group or raid, no matter what size, can cause some issues due to their bleeds and things like that. where interactions between two wardens can kind of mess things up and make things very hard to track even. So they also do have the flexibility, I should point out, being sort of a hybrid melee ranged in the yellow line or the melee spec. You can do a lot of different things to build a warden and still be very good with DPS no matter what you build. You can do some things for consistency if you really need consistency for a fight, or if you need some of the things again in yellow line to be ranged, you can do a lot of stuff like that. I will say also with the warden, their tanking is unfortunately not that great right now, but again, we're going to get to the specific roles actually in the next section. But yeah, this is how my overall class tier list looks. We have, I would say overall it's pretty good. There are two classes that are kind of down in the dumps with Guardian and Runekeeper, but a lot of things are viable between the Champion, Loremaster, Minstrel, Beorning, Burglar, Hunter, and Warden. They are all pretty viable, and you could consider them even though they are in two separate categories here. That's just kind of distinguished so we don't have 7 things in just the viable row. Again, the tier list is nice because you can distinguish, add tiers even though there's little difference. But you have 7 of the 10 classes right there in the viable/excels category, which I think is overall good. The problem is usually that is only one spec that is going to be viable. Again, a couple classes like the Warden, Burglar, Beorning, and Captain are a little bit different with that, but on the note of Captain, they just are better than all the others because all 3 specs can be viable, and again, they're the best tanks in even their red line. The damage support there is of course very good and helpful, especially with like raid content and the such like that. But we'll go ahead and move on to the next category, so let's reset. Okay, so now that that is reset, let's again look at the DPS/damage dealer role and specifically where these classes fit in with that. So the Beorning, unfortunately, they are bad. Not even situational. Their damage, while it's actually pretty good at low levels, it scales horribly with level, and ultimately they are bad for endgame content. Moving on to the next class, we have the Burglar, and they're very good at DPS as I mentioned earlier. Their blue line is not that good, but their red line is pretty good. In fact, I would rate them in the best tier as far as DPS goes. That is because in the red line, they can provide a little bit of support, not all that much, but they can provide a little bit, on top of just insanely high damage. Again, as far as raw damage, which this is the category, they are one of the best as far as that goes. Moving on to the Captain, they are actually a little hesitant to even rate Captain because their red line, their DPS role spec is mainly support, and it's about supporting fellowship damage. So the damage the Captain does on its own in the red line is not all that much, especially if you compare it to other DPSers as far as raw DPS numbers. Again, they support the fellowship, so that's where all their damage comes from, is by boosting fellowship damage for people in your group. So I will actually put them in situational. Again, their damage they output on their own, not all that great, but because they are the support role, that's why I stick them here in situational, because it's very odd the way that works. Moving on, we have the Champion, and as discussed previously, I actually forgot to mention the tank previously when going overall. They are not that great tanks, but for DPS specifically, they are viable single target, viable AoE. They do have that drawback of being melee specifically, and some difficulties with weapon swapping you have to deal with, which I'm not rating this too much about difficulty with the class. We mentioned that with the Warden, the mechanics of it and actually getting that down and all the options you have, and properly playing the Warden and dealing with lag, things like that. But overall, I will not be basing the viability, of course, on difficulty, but that is a little bit of a factor with the Champion that I just thought of. Moving on though, yeah, Champion overall, viable for single target and AoE DPS, both the red and the yellow line. Moving on though, we have the Guardian, and their damage is unfortunately just bad. They are not good at melee damage, and that is about all there is to say about them. The Hunter, as mentioned earlier, is a viable class, but I would actually say they excel at damage. While they don't provide much utility to the group, they don't provide basically any support. I guess Penetrating Shot gives a little bit of a debuff, but they don't provide much utility. But they are very good at damage. That is what this category is based off of. But to really be the best, I would say they either have to by far be the top damage or provide at least a little bit of something extra beneficial to the raid. But they definitely excel because, again, range damage compared to melee damage, if Champion and Hunter did the exact same DPS, the Hunter has a little bit easier time being ranged to excel at the fight. Next up, we have the Loremaster. And this one's going to be a little bit odd because, of course, for raids, these lore masters aren't really liked. Even for 6-man and 3-mans, they sometimes aren't liked, but they have somewhat viable DPS. They have some very strong spells. One of their big weaknesses is actually their pets don't scale. While the pet debuffs are good, the pets themselves don't scale. And if you compare a lore master in the support role to the damage role, of course you'd rather a lore master in the support role. That is one of the problems they suffer with their DPS as well, because their other spec is so good. But yeah, unlikely to actually find a slot in the DPS role as a lore master, but I will say they are overall somewhat viable. It's just you have all these other better options, so it's like, why ever take a lore master if they're only somewhat viable? But they do get into this kind of hard to get into role of somewhat viable. Now, I will also point out with the Lore Master, a lot of their abilities can cause lag, which is one reason they would not actually be wanted. In group content, sometimes is they could cause everybody else in the raid or something to lag, and that will just lower the overall group DPS, overall performance, and things like that. So that actually is a contributing factor, unfortunately. But nonetheless, they still get somewhat viable because they can do some huge AoE damage and some easier content. They can really help you plow through it with some burst there. But moving on, we have the Minstrel, and their DPS is unfortunately not that good. I could almost put it in situational, but it probably properly drops in bad when thinking about group content. Now, it's good for solo, and it might be a little bit better than, say, like Guardian DPS, but it's still overall bad and not really something you'd ever consider for end-game group content for a DPS. Next up, we have the Runekeeper, and as discussed earlier, they are a bad all-around class, so of course they're going to be bad here, unfortunately. Next up, we have the Warden, and they are going to be, again, this is based on the potential of the Warden. They have the potential to be the best with the Burglar, and the Yell line even provides some nice support for the group, so they have two things going on for them there. And again, the flexibility between melee and kind of a hybrid ranged melee as far as the Yell line goes, so that is how the Warden ends up in the best with Burglar, and this is ultimately what it looks like when we really break these classes down by DPS. You have a lot of the classes like the Beorning, who's primarily healer or even tank. You have the Guardian, who's primarily tank, which isn't even that great right now compared to Captain at least. And then you have the Minstrel. All those primarily fill other roles, but they are not good here. The Runekeeper, unfortunately, is just not in a good spot right now. Captain, again, that one is situational. Their red line is largely support-based damage. We'll go over that in the support. The Lore Master, somewhat viable as we covered. Champion, and then Hunter. Both of them viable DPS, but then we have the best as far as the Burglar and Warden there. Next up, we have the tanks for the roles that I will be covering in this one, and I will point out all the classes that don't even have a tank role, we just won't even cover and won't put them on. But first we have the Beorning, and I would consider them viable tanks. You just have the Captain, which is a better option, and that is the main drawback of the Beorning. Otherwise, they are pretty viable tanks, and they are even in a somewhat good spot as far as tanking goes right now, and they can be used as off tanks definitely, or even main tanks for lower difficulty content, or you could even use them as a main tank if you don't have a Captain available for your group, and if you have to work that in. But next up, we have the Captain as far as the next tank option goes, and they are just the best tanks. We already covered this a little bit, but they have the support, they have the strong cooldowns, and just generally good defenses. I will say one weakness of the Captain is aggro, especially AoE aggro, and managing with tons of mobs at once. They would not actually be the best as far as that specific style of tanking goes, so it is something fair to point out, even though overall they are the best tank by far right now. Next up, we have the Champion tank, and they will go in the situational category. Champion tanking is not in a good spot, but they do decent damage as far as tanks go, and if you're doing easier content where a champion can handle it, while it might be more stressful on healers or other group members, they do have that situational use. Or if you only have a champion in your group as the only option to tank, again, it's that situational use. Next up, we have the Guardian, and even though a lot of people may not really think this way about the Guardian being a viable tank, I do consider them a viable tank. It's just the Captain again. Comparing to the Captain, the best tank in the game right now, they are just not that good compared to the Captain, but overall they are still a viable tank, kind of similar to the Beorning. And they are, as far as AoE threat goes, both the Beorning and Guardian, they're really good at tanking multiple enemies at once, which is somewhere where the Captain is not quite as good. So they do have that going for them, and even though there's a lot to criticize or think poorly about the Guardian tank, I do consider them overall viable with the Beorning there. Now the next tanking option we have is the Warden, and I have to put them probably as situational with the Champion. Now, their tanking, similar to the champion, is not in a good spot, but they do really high damage as a tank when you don't need a very, very sturdy tank, and you don't need the Warden to DPS, which is basically never. Usually, if you have a Warden, you want them to do what they're good at, which is DPSing and not tanking, but that is where the situational use comes in. Maybe you do want your Warden to tank and don't have any other options, and you need somebody to like hold aggro and actually have a little bit of defensive boost, and again, they can do a lot of damage as a tank at least. So I do say that as situational, but overall not that good. They are not even somewhat viable. They are situational at best as far as these two goes. But that is the overall look of the tanks. Again, a lot of it is based on the captain just being the best, and that kind of drops down what a lot of the community thinks of the other tanks. Alright, the second to last group that I'm going to cover are the healers, and again we will skip the non-healer classes as far as rating them. And first up we have the Beorning, and it's kind of hard to say this, but I would actually rate them as the best healer, factoring in that they have a lot of strong support and even can do moderate damage with their healing, while again primarily filling the healing role and healing allies up. That is their primary thing that they do, of course, with healing, and that's why they're being rated in this category. But because they provide these other benefits, I feel like they are the best healer in the game at the moment. Now, epic battles aren't really considered difficult group content or anything like that, but I will also point out the L line is very helpful for epic battles because you can heal banners and supply things and all that sort of stuff. So just a random note on the L line Beorning, another positive thing about them. But yeah, also with all the support going on with the Beorning, I don't mean to say that they have bad healing. They do have very good healing and very good AoE healing output to go with all their benefits that they do provide in the L line. And even when thinking about running some more difficult smaller group size content, the Beorning is a very good solo class, so that means that they can support smaller groups very well and have a L line Beorning do very well in the smaller groups like 3-man content and things like that. They can even almost like quasi tank in the L line if they can actually hold aggro and get threat. Of course, they can definitely take the damage and heal it at the same time, so it's another benefit and why I consider them the best healer in the game right now. Next up we have the captain, and they are somewhat viable or situational. I don't know quite where to put them. I'll probably put them in situational because the blue line is really only situationally used in smaller group content. It's not really viable for raid healing, not viable too much for single target healing. When you have situations where everybody in the group is taking little bits of damage and nobody in particular is taking tons of damage at once, or you have somebody else in the group that can provide maybe a little bit of healing if the tank has a lot of self-heal options, as a captain tank might actually have, they are going to be situationally useful in those situations with the blue line, and that is about the most they have to offer at the moment, because as a primary healer they are not really viable, and that is why I think they fit best in the situational category. Now the minstrel is going to be something that excels at healing. I would put them in the best healer category because they're very good to have in a group, but because of the Beorning providing a little bit more overall more beneficial stuff. But don't get me wrong, they're very good healers, and of course in a raid you always want a minstrel, and if you have no other option, minstrel is very good at healing, of course. They also do bring some great utility, of course, with their healing. They have some good cooldowns and a lot of things like that that definitely make them excel at healing. Now moving on, we have the next healer, as I don't consider the L line for the Lore Master to be a healer. The next one we have is the Runekeeper, and they are, I would rate them as somewhat viable. They do have a lot more healing output than the captain. They can even be the best single target healer in the game, so they can have a ton of healing output, but they just lack some emergency heals, some AoE healing. They do have okayish group healing, but overall, compared to the Minstrel and Beorning, they just don't provide enough to the group. Do Not Fall this day is one useful cooldown as an in-combat res, being able to put that on 2 allies, but otherwise they don't overall provide too much where you'd rather a Runekeeper compared to a Minstrel or Beorning if you have those options. But they are somewhat viable healers nonetheless with all that, so you can still take them. You can probably still get by with Runekeeper healers even for difficult content, but they are just not as good as the others. And the big drawback compared to even the Captain, Minstrel, Beorning, all 3 of those healers, is they provide basically no support at all with their healing kit. Alright, moving on, we are finally on to the last category, which is support. Now the Beorning, we covered the Yell line as a healer, so we won't be considering them as a support. Now the Burglar has a Yell line support. Their primary role as a support is of course debuffing, but they actually do provide pretty good damage even in the L line, oddly. Compared to the red line, of course, the L line Burglar does not do quite as much damage, but when you have all those trait points that we have at level 130, you can go into the red line and get some surprisingly decent damage. Because of that, I think they fit in as actually the best support in the game. Because of overall their very strong debuff, some of the utility they provide there, even in situations where you're not fighting like bosses and you can actually stun mobs, they have a little bit of utility there. And they have fellowship maneuvers. Triggering all those, of course, is a benefit in some content or some situations, some mechanics where you still need fellowship maneuvers, even though the actual fellowship maneuvers themselves are basically no good. They do have that benefit to them and that utility, and on top of that, with all their support, again, primarily debuffs, just increasing damage enemy takes, weakening enemies, that sort of stuff, they do provide good damage on top of that. Compared to the next support, we have the Captain. They provide pretty good damage, and I would... Actually, it's kind of hard to rate the Captain because they're primarily a support class. They're definitely not bad. They're definitely at the very least viable. Now, we will continue with this. I will spoiler it that they will be higher than this, but just thinking about it, the Captain is a support class. They have a support kit on every single spec, so the blue line is a kind of support-based tank. Even though the tank is the best in the game, they still have a lot of support with that, so that's something you do have to consider. And then even the red line, it is the DPS spec, but it is a support spec that supports group DPS. And then you have the blue line, while the support there is actually healing allies. You can kind of think of it like that, and maybe a little bit of defensive support. They have all that going for them, and because of that and just that vast utility they provide, I also consider them the best support in the game, with their red line support of course being very good. But even in the tanking spec, while that's primarily a tank spec and I'm not really rating this on that, that is something that they do provide as an overall support based class. So it's a little bit odd because again, every single one of their specs is even support based, even though it primarily might fill the tank damage healer trio, their overall support, and that's why I think they fit in best. It's kind of hard as I'm going through this, probably easy to tell, it's kind of hard to rate Captain because of that. Now, compared to the Lore Master, that's going to be our next support with the yellow line, of course. They are viable. I would even say excels, but I'm only going to rate them as viable. Compared to, say, the Burglar, they fill a very similar role as the Burglar support, actually. The L-Line Burglar debuffs enemies, the L-Line Lore Master debuffs enemies. Now, the L-Line Lore Master does have some extra utility with heals, debuff removers, things like that, and just a lot of extra stuff with them that is support-based compared to the Yellow Line Burglar. But the damage they output and other stuff other than raw support is not all that much, and usually Yellow Line Lore Master is relegated to just raid content. It's probably not the best thing for like 6-man content or 3-man instances. While you can choose it, usually have some other options that you would prefer. So I only rate the Yellow Line Lore Master as viable. Now for every raid in the game, again, Lore Master, you want at least one of them in Yellow Line, so because of that they are viable, but they don't really quite excel with the tier and considering the benefits that the other classes up there do provide. Now the next one, it's kind of hard to rate something else as support. Again, the Hunter, technically the L-Line, you could kind of consider that support, but if we did, it would go right into the bad category, so it's kind of silly to do that. But the L-Line Minstrel is actually a support role, oddly enough, even though it actually provides healing is one of the things they do. It's kind of a hybrid between the DPS and blue line, the red line and blue line. With the Minstrel, you run the in-between stance usually, even though you do have the flexibility to go the DPS stance, whatever it's called. It's not word speech anymore, but that's what it used to be. Anyway, it's kind of odd to put them here, but I will just say, because they are technically a support spec and I do want this tier list to be complete, I would put them at situational, because the L-Line is not the most viable, but it is something that can be considered in some situations. It's actually a yellow line. You could switch to the yellow line before a fight and then provide like all these strong yellow line buffs, increased anthem duration, all sorts of things like that, then switch to the blue line and primarily be a healer, but actually have some residual benefit from the yellow line due to that. Now that is something that I think minstrels do in the game, but that is also a little bit odd and I think unfair to rate the minstrel as a support just based on that. Now I will also say, if you don't need the raw healing output of the blue line, you can get more benefit with the minstrel and yellow line even in raid content. So it is something that is situational. If you don't need the extra healing output from the blue line minstrel, you can definitely go to the yellow line. It's just as a raw support, thinking support only and ignoring all the other specs and roles that a minstrel might have. it's probably not going to be preferred for just its support compared to, say, a Captain, Burglar, or Lore Master. So that's why I think it falls in the situational category, thinking their yellow line support. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this video. Actually, we have completed all the categories for overall DPS, tanks, healers, support, and all that. And it was actually a bit long to get through, but compared to my previous tier list, I just really wanted this to be thorough and cover like each role individually. I think it's very important to do that, especially when discussing particularly viability. So I hope that helped you all, and hope that helped you all learn about the classes and how they are viable in LOTRO and compared to the other classes, what choices you have as far as the current balance. Again, this is 2021, pre-Gundabad and pre-Brawler era. As far as the viability goes, viability of course changes as updates are released, things get nerfed, things get buffed, and all that sort of stuff. Even the content can change, actually, the viability. Maybe some content is unfriendly to all melee DPS, so they just go to like situational or bad category because of things like that. So that is just some things to consider and think about in the future if you're like actually making a class right now just based on their current viability. That could definitely change by the time you get to the level cap. So I do really want to mention that I think it's important to know that and think about that sort of stuff when deciding your class just based on their current viability. But again, I do actually think this video could be helpful for people to just learn about the classes and their strengths and weaknesses and how they do compared to other classes. For future tier lists that I do, I definitely would appreciate it, especially doing this objective style just based on viability. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on the classes down below in the comments. So if you want to comment on any of my thoughts or just have anything to input about classes that maybe I didn't cover for this video, please do share, and I'll be interested to take that in and read about it. And finally, I do want to remind you all that my next tier list video will actually be my favorites tier list. So that is going to be on my opinion of the classes, how fun I find them, and how just overall enjoyable they are for me to play at the moment, again focusing on the pre-Brawler, pre-Gundabad era. And as far as this video goes, again, I hope it was helpful with the classes, and I hope you all did enjoy it. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content. And thanks for watching, everyone.